Welcome. The archive is now open. Tonight, from our restricted collection, we are unsealing 6 case files documenting the unexplained phenomena of park rangers. The accounts you are about to hear are not fiction. They have been meticulously sourced from ranger logbooks, official incident reports, and search and rescue debriefs and preserved within this archive for professional review. The world believes these stories are lost to time. We ensure they are not forgotten. If you believe that certain knowledge must be preserved, subscribe to the Nocturnal Archive and activate the notification bell to be alerted of our next acquisition. After reviewing these files, leave your own analysis or related experiences in the comments below. Now, find your comfort in the darkness. Let the noise of the day fade as we access the first file. The files regarding the decommissioning of Firewatch Tower 4 in the Blackwood sector are extensive. They consist of maintenance logs, structural integrity reports, and the final contested audit submitted by Senior Logistics Officer Arthur Vance. To understand the irregularities that would later be cataloged as Incident 904, one must first understand the man who recorded them. Arthur Vance was a creature of precision. In a park service, often characterized by the chaotic unpredictability of nature, Vance was an anchor of absolute order. He did not view the forest as a place of mystery. He viewed it as a biological asset that required management, quantification, and periodic review. His assignment that Thursday was routine, though arduous. Tower 4, a glass-walled sentinel perched on the granite spine of the northern ridge, was slated for automation. Vance's role was to conduct the final inventory, secure the physical assets, and verify that the analog systems had been properly powered down before the digital sensors took over. It was a task that required a meticulous eye, the kind of job most rangers avoided, but which Vance found strangely soothing. It offered a binary clarity. An object was either present or missing. A switch was either on or off. The hike to the ridge took 4 hours. The Blackwood sector was known for its dense, old-growth canopy, a tangle of fir and hemlock that swallowed light and sound with equal efficiency. Vance moved through the undergrowth with a steady, measured gait, his breathing regulated, his trekking poles clicking against the stones in a rhythmic cadence that matched the ticking of his watch. The air grew thinner and colder as he ascended, carrying the metallic scent of ozone and the damp, earthy smell of impending rain. By the time the tower came into view, the sky had bruised a deep, swollen purple. The structure itself was a relic of the mid-20th century, a steel skeleton rising 60 feet above the tree line, capped by a square cabin of reinforced glass and timber. It stood stark against the roiling clouds, a monument to human surveillance in a landscape that preferred to remain unseen. Vance paused at the base of the structure, adjusting the straps of his pack. He noted, with professional satisfaction, that the brush around the concrete footings had been cleared to regulation distance. He checked his watch. 16 hours, on schedule. The climb up the open metal staircase was accompanied by the rising wind. The steel grid steps rang out under his boots, a lonely, industrial sound that drifted away into the vast silence of the valley below. With every 10 feet of elevation, the temperature dropped perceptibly. The wind began to sing through the cross-bracing, a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the handrails and into Vance's gloves. He did not look down. His focus remained fixed on the trapdoor above him, the threshold between the exposure of the storm and the sanctuary of the cabin. Reaching the catwalk that encircled the cabin, Vance retrieved the heavy brass key from his belt pouch. The metal was cold enough to burn. He inserted it into the lock mechanism of the heavy exterior door. The tumblers turned with a heavy, oiled slide, a sensation of mechanical perfection that pleased him. He pushed the door inward. It swung open on silent hinges, and he stepped across the threshold, sealing the wind and the cold behind him with a firm, decisive click of the latch. The interior of the tower was a study in stillness. The air here was dry and still, preserving the smells of the decades: cedarwood, old varnish, kerosene, and the faint, sharp tang of radio electronics. Vance stood for a moment in the center of the room, allowing his senses to adjust to the sudden absence of wind. The cabin was a perfect square, surrounded on all 4 sides by windows that offered a panoramic view of the darkening wilderness. In the center of the room stood the primary workstation, a wide, wooden desk, scarred by years of use, yet swept clean. Beside it, the dormant radio transponder sat like a dark monolith. Vance removed his pack and set it on the floor. He did not collapse into a chair or take a moment to rest. Instead, he began the ritual of arrival. It was a procedure he had refined over 20 years of field service, a sequence of actions designed to impose his own order upon a new environment. First, the perimeter check. He walked the circuit of the windows, inspecting the seals for cracks or leaks. The glass was thick, cold to the touch. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain began to impact the panes, leaving long, distorting streaks that blurred the tree line into a smear of gray and green. Next, the environmental controls. He approached the small propane heater mounted in the corner. He turned the valve, struck a match, and watched the blue flame bloom with a soft whoosh. He adjusted the dial until the hiss settled into a steady, comforting whisper. The warmth would take time to fill the space, but the visual of the flame was enough to push back the psychological weight of the storm gathering outside. Finally, the workstation. Vance unpacked his equipment with the deliberate care of a surgeon laying out instruments. His logbook, bound in standard-issue green vinyl, was placed on the left. His pen, a heavy-barreled ballpoint, was aligned parallel to the spine. His thermos, filled with black coffee, was set to the right. On a coaster he had brought from home, he withdrew the decommissioning checklist, a 3-page document of dense text, and smoothed it flat on the desk surface. The room began to warm. The smell of propane mixed with the scent of the coffee he poured into the cup's lid. Vance took a sip, the heat spreading through his chest, grounding him. He sat in the swivel chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight. He spun slowly, taking in the view. To the north, the storm front was a wall of charcoal cloud, erasing the horizon. To the south, the valley was a deep well of shadow. He was the highest point for miles, a solitary observer in a glass box suspended above the world. There was a profound comfort in this isolation. Here, there were no unexpected variables, no personnel disputes, no budget meetings, no erratic tourists, just the wind, the glass, and the list. He felt the tension of the hike drain from his shoulders. This was his domain. The tower was a machine for seeing, and he was its operator. He picked up his pen and clicked at once. The sound was sharp and distinct in the quiet room. He opened the station logbook to the first fresh page. The paper was crisp, the lines waiting to be filled with data. He checked his watch again. 16:25 hours. He wrote the date in the upper right corner, his handwriting neat, blocky, and devoid of flourish. Entry 001. Senior Logistics Officer A. Vance on site. Perimeter secure. Environmental systems active. Commencing preliminary inventory of Class B assets. He set the pen down. The rain was falling harder now, a rhythmic drumming on the roof that wrapped the cabin in a cocoon of white noise. It was a sound that usually induced sleep, but Vance was awake, his mind sharp, ready to work. He reached for the station's official manifest, a binder left on the desk by the previous maintenance crew. It was thick, dusty, and sat slightly askew, a minor imperfection in the otherwise orderly room. Vance pulled the binder toward him. As he did, he noticed something beneath it. The station's daily logbook, the permanent record that was supposed to remain in the tower, was not closed. It was lying open, face up, pushed slightly toward the back of the desk near the radio. This was a violation of protocol. The logbook was to be closed and secured in the fireproof drawer when not in use. Vance felt a flicker of annoyance. The previous shift had been careless. He reached out to close the book, intending to file it away before starting his own records. But as his hand hovered over the page, his eyes caught the date written at the top of the open entry. It was today's date. Vance paused. His hand remained suspended in the air. The rain drummed against the glass, louder now, insistent. He looked closer at the page. The ink was fresh, a dark blue ballpoint, identical to the one he held in his own hand. The handwriting was not the scrawl of the maintenance crew, nor the hasty script of a seasonal ranger. It was neat. It was blocky. It was devoid of flourish. He leaned forward, the leather chair groaning softly in the silence. He read the first line of the entry, and the warmth of the room seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sudden, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Entry 001. Senior Logistics Officer A. Vance on site. Perimeter secure. Environmental systems active. Commencing preliminary inventory of Class B assets. Vance stared at the words. He looked at his own notebook, sitting to his left, where he had just written that exact sentence. He looked back at the station log. The timestamp next to the entry in the station book read 8 hours, 8 in the morning. He had been miles away at 8 hours, driving the access road, sipping coffee in his truck. He had not been here. He could not have been here. Vance sat back slowly. The wind gusted, rattling the window frames and their casings. He looked around the empty room, the glass walls reflecting only the dim interior and his own pale face staring back. The silence of the tower, once comforting, now felt heavy, as if the air pressure had suddenly dropped. He was alone. He was certain of it, and yet, on the desk before him, the evidence suggested otherwise. The implications of the logbook entry did not immediately register as fear. For a man like Arthur Vance, an anomaly in the data was not a source of terror, but a problem of reconciliation. It was an equation that had failed to balance. He sat motionless in the leather chair, the sound of the rain against the glass becoming a distant, rhythmic drumbeat, secondary to the silence radiating from the open book. He did not touch the page again. Instead, he leaned closer, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a trained auditor. He knew that the truth of a document often lay not in the words themselves, but in the pressure of the ink, the angle of the stroke, the subtle degradation of the writer's motor control. He treated the logbook as a crime scene. Vance compared the entry in the station log to the one he had just written in his personal notebook. The similarities were forensic in their exactitude. The capital A in Arthur had the same distinct, flat top, a habit he had developed in drafting school 20 years prior. The J in logistics possessed the same tight, efficient loop. Even the spacing between the words was identical, measured with a subconscious precision that he had never seen replicated by another hand. And yet, the timestamp remained. 8 hours. He ran a mental diagnostic of his day. At 8, he had been at the Sector 4 trailhead, signing out the vehicle keys from the master lockbox. There were witnesses. The depot guard had made a comment about the weather. The digital fob on the truck had recorded his ignition time. The impossibility of his presence in the tower was absolute. Logic, therefore, dictated that the entry was a fabrication. Vance exhaled, a long, controlled breath that fogged the air slightly in the cooling room. He sat back, the leather creaking. A hypothesis formed. This was a test. The region was slated for automation. Personnel were being evaluated. Perhaps the previous maintenance crew, known for their rough humor, had studied his handwriting. Perhaps this was an elaborate hazing ritual for the man from logistics who came to shut down their station. It was a breach of protocol, certainly. It was a misuse of government property, but it was rational. It fit within the laws of physics and the somewhat looser laws of bureaucratic behavior. Vance felt the tension in his chest uncoil. Anger replaced the unease. He reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a red correction pen, the instrument of his authority. He did not tear the page out. Destruction of records was a fireable offense. Instead, he employed the standard procedure for data correction. With a steady hand, he drew a single, crisp red line through the fraudulent entry. Beside it, in the margin, he wrote, "Entry invalid. Anomalous data. Author verification failed." He initialed the correction. A.V. 1635. He capped the pen with a sharp click. The sound was a punctuation mark, ending the incident. He had reasserted control. The anomaly had been categorized, flagged, and nullified. Vance stood up and walked to the window. The sun had fully retreated behind the storm front, and the light in the valley was failing rapidly. The glass walls of the cabin, which by day offered commanding authority over the landscape, now underwent a transformation. As the exterior world darkened, the interior of the cabin began to reflect itself. The windows became black mirrors. Vance saw himself reflected against the night, a tall, slender figure in a gray uniform, standing alone in a box of light suspended in the void. Beyond his reflection, the trees were no longer individual pines and firs, but a single, cohesive mass of shadow, swaying violently in the wind. The storm was hitting the ridge with full force now. The metal skeleton of the tower groaned, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into the soles of his boots. He checked the inventory list again. The next task was the communications check. He needed to contact dispatch, confirm his secure status, and, he decided, file a formal reprimand regarding the logbook tampering. He returned to the desk. The radio unit was a heavy, gray metal box from the 1980 seconds, bolted to the timber. Its dials were worn smooth by generations of fingers. Vance reached out and flipped the power toggle. The amber standby light flickered, then glowed steady. A low hum of static filled the room, the sound of the atmosphere bleeding into the receiver. Vance adjusted the squelch knob, filtering out the background radiation until the hiss became a quiet, granular wash of white noise. He keyed the microphone, pressing the side button with his thumb. "Dispatch, this is Logistics Officer Vance at Tower 4. Commencing scheduled comms check. Over." He released the button. The static returned, unchanged. He waited the standard 10 seconds. "Dispatch, Tower 4. Signal check. Over." Silence. Not the silence of a dead line, but the thick, occupied silence of a frequency that was open but unanswered. It was common in these deep valleys. The storm interference was likely scattering the signal. Vance reached for the frequency dial to switch to the repeater channel. Before his fingers grazed the knob, the static changed. It did not cut out. It did not resolve into the clear voice of the dispatcher. Instead, the quality of the white noise shifted. It deepened, acquiring a texture that sounded less like electronic interference and more like heavy, labored breathing. Vance froze. His hand hovered inches from the dial. From the speaker, a voice emerged. It did not crackle or pop. It was clear, intimate, and terrifyingly familiar. "Dispatch," the voice said. "This is Logistics Officer Vance at Tower 4. Commencing scheduled comms check. Over." Vance stared at the radio. The voice was not a recording. It lacked the tinny compression of a playback loop. It possessed the wet, organic timbre of a throat-shaping air in real time, and it was his voice. It was not merely a similarity. It was his cadence, his specific inflection, the precise way he flattened his vowels when speaking into a microphone. It was the sound of his own throat, stripped of the bone conduction that usually distorted it to his own ears. Vance stood paralyzed. His mind scrambled for the rationalization he had relied upon moments ago. A recording, a prank, but the timing was impossible. He had just spoken those words seconds ago. No device could record, process, and rebroadcast with such fidelity in that time frame without a delay that would be perceptible. The radio clicked, signaling the end of the transmission. Then, the static dipped again. "Dispatch," the voice in the radio repeated. "Tower 4. Signal check. Over." Vance backed away from the desk. His boots scuffed loudly on the wooden floor. The radio responded to the sound of his movement. "Over," the voice said. But this time, the intonation was different. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a confirmation. Vance reached the edge of the room, his back pressing against the cold glass of the window. He was trapped in the light, while the source of the voice, the impossibility, sat in the small, gray box on the desk. "Who is this?" Vance whispered. He did not key the microphone. He spoke to the room, to the air. The radio crackled. The voice that answered did not repeat his previous transmission. It spoke a new sentence, one that Vance had not yet said, but had written only moments before in the logbook. "Entry invalid," the voice recited, calm and detached. "Anomalous data. Author verification failed." The words hung in the damp air. The wind outside rose to a shriek, battering the glass, demanding entry. Vance realized with a sickening, plummeting sensation that the voice was not coming from a distant dispatch center. The signal strength was maximum. There was no atmospheric distortion. The transmission was originating from the bottom of the tower. The realization that the transmission originated from the immediate vicinity of the tower did not induce panic, as one might expect. Instead, it triggered a sudden, rigid crystallization of Arthur Vance's logic. Fear is a reaction to the unknown. However, a signal broadcasting from the base of the structure was a known variable. It implied a transmitter. A transmitter implied a power source, a frequency modulator, and, most importantly, an operator. Vance backed away from the radio, his movements precise and controlled. He did not scramble. He did not shout into the receiver. He simply reached out with a steady hand and turned the volume dial counterclockwise until it clicked into the off position. His voice was silenced instantly, cut mid-sentence. The room returned to the dominion of the storm. The wind buffeted the glass walls with renewed intensity, a chaotic symphony of rattling frames and driving rain that felt, by comparison, entirely rational. Vance stood in the center of the room, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. He began to process the data through the filter of his training. The anomaly was auditory. It was a high-fidelity reproduction of his own vocal patterns, repeating information he had only just recorded. While disturbing, this was not scientifically impossible. High-end field recorders could loop audio. Directional speakers could project sound, the handwriting in the logbook, the voice on the radio, the timing. The pattern resolved itself in his mind not as a haunting, but as a coordinated effort. This was a hazing ritual. It was the only explanation that fit the parameters of the physical world. The maintenance crew, or perhaps the younger rangers from the Sector 4 depot, had set this up. They were testing the desk jockey, the auditor sent to decommission their beloved tower. They had likely planted a bug in the room to record him, then played it back to unnerve him. The handwriting was a forgery, practiced and prepared in advance. It was elaborate. It was unprofessional, but it was human. A wave of cold indignation washed over him, replacing the initial chill of fear. He felt a tightness in his jaw. To interfere with a federal audit was a serious infraction. To tamper with emergency communication channels was a felony. He adjusted his glasses, pushing them up the bridge of his nose. He would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He would not radio dispatch in a panic, nor would he flee into the storm. He would simply refuse to participate in their theater. Vance turned his back on the radio. He returned to the workstation and sat down, the leather chair groaning in protest. He looked at the red line he had drawn through the logbook entry. It stood out against the white paper, a mark of correction, of order reestablished. He reached for his thermos. The coffee inside was still hot. He poured a small amount into the lid, watching the steam rise in a twisting gray column. He held the cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his palms. He took a sip. The bitterness was grounding. It tasted of reality. He glanced at his watch. 16:42 hours. He pulled the decommissioning checklist toward him. He would continue the work. He would proceed as if the room were silent, as if he were truly alone. If there were observers watching from the tree line, waiting for him to crack, they would see only a man doing his job. Item 14. Verify structural bolt integrity on primary window casings. Vance stood up, clipboard in hand. He walked to the north-facing window. The glass was dark, a sheet of obsidian against the night. He could see nothing of the outside world, only the reflection of the cabin interior, the glow of the propane heater, the empty desk, and his own silhouette standing tall and severe. He inspected the bolts securing the frame. He checked for rust, for stress fractures, for loose nuts. He marked the item as pass on his list. He moved to the east window. Pass. The south window. Pass. His methodical pace was a weapon. With every check mark, he reinforced the walls of his logic. The tower was a structure of steel and glass. It was governed by engineering principles. It held no secrets, only inventory. He reached the west window. This side faced the trail, the direction from which he had come. He paused. He leaned closer to the glass, shielding his eyes with his hand to block the reflection of the heater. He peered down into the abyss. The storm had erased the ground. There was only the driving sleet, illuminated briefly by the ambient light of the cabin before disappearing into the dark. Somewhere down there, 60 feet below, stood the base of the tower. Somewhere down there, according to his logic, stood a person with a radio. They would be cold, he thought, with a grim sense of satisfaction. They would be soaked to the bone, shivering in the mud, waiting for a reaction that would never come. He was warm. He was dry. He had supplies for 3 days. He could wait them out. He turned away from the window, dismissing the thought of them. He returned to the desk and sat down. Item 15. Inventory emergency flare supply. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside lay the heavy orange case containing the flare gun and 3 rounds of incendiary ammunition. He lifted the case onto the desk and unlatched it. The distinct metallic clack of the latches echoed in the quiet room. He inspected the flare gun. It was a flare pistol, outdated but functional. The barrel was clean. The firing pin was free of corrosion. He counted the shells. 1, 2, 3. He hesitated. Protocol dictated that the flares be kept in the case, locked in the drawer. But the wind was howling louder now, shaking the floorboards beneath his feet. The isolation felt absolute. If the power failed, if the heater died, if the pranksters decided to escalate, Vance rationalized the deviation. In a severe storm, emergency equipment should be readily accessible. It was a safety precaution, A matter of readiness, he took the flare gun out of the case and set it on the desktop, to the right of his logbook. He placed the 3 shells in a neat row beside it. He felt a slight tremor in his hand as he let go of the weapon. He clasped his hands together on the desk to steady them. He was not afraid, he told himself again. He was merely prepared. Preparation was the antidote to chaos. He looked at the radio again. The amber standby light was still glowing, a single, unblinking eye. The unit was silent. His refusal to engage had worked. The game was over. He picked up his pen to sign off on item 15. As the tip of the pen touched the paper, a sound cut through the noise of the wind. It was not electronic. It was not the crackle of a speaker or the hum of interference. It was a physical sound, heavy and dull. Clang. Vance froze. The pen remained touching the paper, bleeding a small, dark circle of ink into the page. He listened. The wind whistled through the girders. The rain lashed the roof. He waited, his heart rate beginning to climb despite his rigid control. Perhaps it was a falling branch. Perhaps it was the thermal expansion of the steel beams. Clang. It was closer this time. Louder. It was the sound of a boot striking a metal step. Vance's eyes darted to the floor, as if he could see through the timber planks to the open staircase beneath. The sound was unmistakable. It was the distinct, rhythmic impact of a heavy tread on a steel grate. Clang. Someone was climbing the tower. Vance sat motionless. His theory of the pranksters at the base crumbled. If they were climbing, they were breaking the rules of the game. They were entering his perimeter. This was no longer observation. This was intrusion. He looked at the trapdoor in the corner of the room. It was the only way in. He had locked it. He remembered the sensation of the heavy bolt sliding home. He remembered checking it. Clang. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. There was no hesitation. No pause for breath against the wind. It was a steady, mechanical ascent. Vance stood up slowly. He did not pick up the clipboard. He reached out and wrapped his hand around the grip of the flare gun. The cold plastic felt foreign in his palm. He was a logistics officer. He dealt with supply chains and inventory audits. He did not deal with intruders. He moved toward the trap door, keeping his distance, positioning himself behind the heavy oak desk. He told himself that it was the maintenance crew. They were coming up to confront him, to laugh at his seriousness, to admit to the joke. He would report them. He would have their badges. He would ensure they never worked in the park service again. Clang. The footsteps stopped. Vance held his breath. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against his eardrums. The intruder was standing on the catwalk, directly outside the heavy steel door. Vance watched the handle. It was a solid, L-shaped lever made of iron. Slowly, noiselessly, the handle began to turn. The rotation of the handle was smooth, mechanical, and indifferent. It continued until the internal latch struck the deadbolt with a dull, final thud. The mechanism held. The heavy steel door did not give way. The lock, a piece of hardened steel installed during the Cold War, performed its function with the binary reliability Arthur Vance so admired. Access was denied. Vance exhaled, the breath leaving his lungs in a shuddering rush that he could not entirely suppress. He remained behind the heavy oak desk, his knuckles white as they gripped the orange plastic of the flare gun. The physical laws of the universe were still in effect. Steel was stronger than flesh. A locked door remained locked unless the proper credentials were presented. He waited for the pounding. He expected the intruder to realize the door was secured and to react with frustration, to hammer on the metal, to shout to be let in, to demand shelter from the freezing rain. That was the human reaction. That was what a maintenance worker, or a lost hiker, or a prankster would do. But there was no pounding. The handle simply released. It rotated back to its original, horizontal position with a slow, spring-loaded groan. Then, silence returned to the catwalk. The wind continued to shriek through the girders, and the rain continued to lash the glass. But from the space directly beyond the door, there was no sound of movement. The intruder did not walk away. They did not stomp their boots to stay warm. They simply stood there, motionless in the freezing downpour, separated from the warmth of the cabin by 2 inches of industrial steel. Vance cleared his throat. The sound was small and dry in the enclosed space. He needed to reassert his authority. He was the senior logistics officer. This was a federal facility. "This is a restricted area," Vance called out. His voice was louder than he intended, cracking slightly on the first syllable. He steadied it. "The tower is closed for decommissioning. Identify yourself." He waited. He watched the gap beneath the door, looking for the shift of a shadow or the gleam of a flashlight beam. There was nothing. "I am armed," Vance added, the lie tasting like copper in his mouth. The flare gun was a signaling device, not a weapon, though at close range, its thermal output would be catastrophic. "Step away from the door and announce your intentions." The silence from the catwalk stretched out, heavy and unnatural. It was a silence that felt attentive, as if the storm itself were pausing to listen to his heartbeat. Then, the feedback loop re-engaged. It did not come from the door. It came from the desk. The radio, which Vance had silenced only minutes before, clicked. The volume dial, which he had personally rotated to the off position, remained physically set to 0. Yet, the amber standby light flared to a brilliant, piercing orange, and the speaker cone vibrated with a sudden surge of power. The static was gone. The clarity was absolute. "Identify yourself," the radio said. It was Vance's voice again. But this time, it was not a recording of his previous log entry. It was a recording of the words he had spoken only seconds ago, echoed back to him with zero degradation. The tone was not mocking. It was flat, bureaucratic. It sounded like a system query. Vance stared at the gray metal box, the impossibility of it pressed against his temples. To record him, they would need a microphone inside the room. To play it back through a deactivated receiver, they would need to bypass the physical circuitry of the device. "I am armed," the radio continued. "Step away from the door." The machine was processing his inputs and returning them. It was a dialogue with a mirror. Vance reached out to rip the power cord from the wall, but his hand froze as a new sound cut through the electronic echo. It was a sound far more terrifying than the voice on the radio because of its simplicity, its banality. It was the sound of metal sliding against metal. Scrape, click. It was the specific, distinct friction of a brass key being inserted into a wafer tumbler lock. Vance's eyes snapped back to the door. The handle was stationary, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was unlocking the door from the outside. His hand flew to his belt pouch. His fingers fumbled with the canvas flap, tearing it open. He felt the cold, hard shape of the station key resting securely inside. He pulled it out, holding it up to the light, staring at it with a desperate, frantic confusion. There was only one key. The protocol for decommissioning was strict. The sector warden held the master. The logistics officer held the active field key. There were no duplicates. The maintenance crew had turned theirs in 3 days ago. Vance had audited the handover himself. He had signed the form. He had logged the serial numbers. Scrape, click, clack. The sound from the door was methodical. The intruder was not fumbling. They were not picking the lock. They were engaging the mechanism with a key that fit perfectly. Vance watched the deadbolt knob on the inside of the door. It was a heavy, rusted piece of iron that had not moved without effort for 20 years. Slowly, impossibly, the knob began to rotate. It turned to the left, fighting the friction of the rust, driven by a steady, powerful torque from the other side. Vance stepped back. His heel caught the edge of the floor mat, and he stumbled, bracing himself against the glass wall. The cold of the window seeped instantly through his uniform, shocking his skin. He raised the flare gun, leveling the wide, orange barrel at the door. His hands were trembling now, a violent tremor that he could not control. "Stop," he shouted. "Do not enter." The radio on the desk clicked. "Stop," it repeated, in Vance's own voice, calm and detached. "Do not enter." The deadbolt finished its rotation with a sharp snap. The door was unlocked. For a moment, nothing happened. The wind howled. The rain battered the roof. The radio hummed. Vance gripped the flare gun with both hands. He calculated the distance. 10 feet. If the door opened, he would fire. He would flood the entryway with 2,000 degrees of magnesium fire. He would explain it to the review board later. He would produce the unauthorized logbook. He would justify the use of force. The handle turned again. This time, there was no resistance. The heavy steel door swung inward. It did not crash open. It moved with a smooth, deliberate slowness, pushed by a steady hand. The storm did not rush in immediately. The door acted as a shield for a split second. Then, the seal was broken. A gust of freezing wind ripped through the cabin. Papers flew from the desk, swirling into the air like white birds. The decommissioning checklist, the meticulous inventory, the station logs, all of them were lifted and scattered in a chaotic vortex. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The propane heater's flame flickered violently, casting wild, dancing shadows against the walls. Vance squinted against the sudden blast of rain that sprayed into the room. He tightened his finger on the trigger. "Stay back," he screamed over the roar of the wind. A figure stepped across the threshold. It was a man. He was tall, wearing the standard-issue gray waterproof slicker of the Park Service. The hood was pulled up, casting the face in deep shadow. He wore heavy leather boots, soaked with mud. He carried no weapon. His hands were empty, hanging loosely at his sides. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. He leaned his weight against the steel, pushing it shut against the wind until the latch clicked. He reached up and turned the deadbolt, locking it again. The roar of the storm was instantly cut off, replaced by the heavy, dripping silence of the cabin. The figure stood by the door, water pooling around his boots, dark stains spreading across the wooden floorboards. He did not look at Vance. He did not acknowledge the flare gun pointed at his chest. He reached up with gloved hands and lowered his hood. Vance's breath caught in his throat. The flare gun wavered. The man standing by the door was dry. Despite the rain that had just blown in, despite the water pooling on the floor, the man's uniform was pristine. The gray wool was perfectly pressed. The collar was stiff. The badge on his chest, Senior Logistics Officer, gleamed under the propane light, polished and free of tarnish. His face was calm. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles, pushing them up the bridge of his nose with a gesture that Vance knew intimately. He looked at Vance. The eyes were familiar. The set of the jaw was familiar. The thinning hair, combed precisely to the left, was familiar. It was not a monster. It was not a ghost. It was Arthur Vance. But it was an Arthur Vance who had not hiked 4 hours in the rain. It was an Arthur Vance who had not been sweating in a cold tower. It was an Arthur Vance who was composed, efficient, and ready to work. The intruder walked past the real Vance as if he were a piece of furniture. He moved to the desk, stepping around the scattered papers without looking down. He sat in a leather chair, which did not creak under his weight. He picked up the pen. He opened the logbook to the page where Vance had drawn the red line. Vance lowered the flare gun. His logic, his precious rationality, was not just fracturing, it was dissolving. He tried to speak, to form a question that could bridge the gap between what he saw and what he knew. But his voice had deserted him. It was trapped in the radio box. The other Arthur Vance looked up from the logbook. He offered a small, polite nod, the kind one gives to a subordinate who has been dismissed. "Shift change," the other Arthur said. The phrase "shift change" did not echo. It was absorbed instantly by the heavy, damp silence of the cabin, settling into the wood and the glass like a layer of dust. The words were not a threat. They were a procedural statement, delivered with the flat, unquestionable authority of a supervisor noting the time on a punch card. Arthur Vance stood by the desk, his hand still hovering near the flare gun, though the weapon now felt absurd, a toy held in the face of a monolith. The figure in the chair did not look at him again. The other Arthur Vance, the dry, efficient, pristine version of himself, had already turned his attention to the work. Vance watched, paralyzed by a terrifying vertigo, as the figure reached out and adjusted the angle of the desk lamp. The movement was precise. It was exactly how Vance would have done it. The figure picked up the pen, testing the tip against the margin of the logbook with 2 short, sharp scratches. The sound was dry and scratching, magnified in the quiet room. Scritch, scritch. Then, the writing began. Vance stood just feet away, dripping water onto the floorboards, shivering violently as the adrenaline crashed into shock. He watched his hand move across the paper. The rhythm was steady. The loops of the letters were uniform. It was the writing of a man who was completely at ease, a man who belonged in this chair, in this tower, in this reality. Vance realized with a sickening, hollow certainty that he was no longer the protagonist of this scene. He was the disruption. He was the error that the system had corrected. The man in the chair was the Senior Logistics Officer. Vance was merely a wet, trembling echo standing in a puddle of rainwater. The logic of the situation was brutal in its simplicity. 2 objects cannot occupy the same space. 2 operators cannot hold the same post. One was valid. The other was redundant. The figure in the chair turned a page. The sound of the paper crinkling was dismissive. It was a signal that the transition was complete. The audit would continue. The files would be organized. The decommissioning would proceed according to schedule. Vance felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave. It was not a flight response born of terror, but a deep, primal understanding that he had been evicted. The warmth of the propane heater no longer reached him. The light of the desk lamp seemed to bend away from him, pulling exclusively around the figure in the chair. The air in the cabin tasted stale, recycled, as if there wasn't enough oxygen for 2 sets of lungs. He took a step back. The figure did not flinch. It did not pause in its writing. It ignored him with the absolute indifference of a mountain ignoring a climber. Vance took another step, his boots squelching softly. He looked at the flare gun on the desk. He should pick it up. He should demand answers. But the logic of the room had shifted. To pick up the weapon would be an act of aggression by an intruder against the rightful occupant. It felt impossible, like trying to scream in a dream and finding one's mouth filled with cotton. He backed all the way to the steel door. The metal was cold against his spine, vibrating slightly with the force of the storm raging on the other side. He reached behind him, his fingers fumbling for the deadbolt. He found the cold iron knob. He turned it. The mechanism retracted with a heavy clack. The figure in the chair did not look up. Vance pressed down on the handle. The latch released. The wind caught the edge of the door, ripping it from his grip and flinging it outward into the night. The storm roared into the cabin, a chaotic wall of freezing mist and noise. The papers on the desk fluttered, but the figure simply placed a heavy hand over the logbook, smoothing the page down, barely breaking the rhythm of the pen. Vance stepped backward, crossing the threshold, moving from the sanctuary of the light into the blindness of the dark. He grabbed the heavy steel handle with both hands and pulled the door shut. He fought against the wind, leaning his entire body weight into the motion until the latch engaged. Click. He was outside. The contrast was immediate and violent. The wind on the catwalk was a physical force, shoving him against the railing. The rain was not falling. It was being driven horizontally, stinging his face like buckshot. The cold clamped down on him, penetrating his soaked uniform instantly. Vance stood alone on the metal grate, 60 feet above the ground, in the middle of a black wilderness. He gripped the icy railing, gasping for air, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned to look back at the door. He half expected it to open again, for the figure to come out and finish him, to push him over the edge. But the door remained shut. It sat solid and immovable, a barrier of gray steel. He looked through the small, reinforced window set into the door at eye level. Inside, the cabin was glowing with a warm, amber light. It looked peaceful. It looked secure. Vance could see the back of the leather chair. He could see the gray uniform of the officer sitting there. He saw the figure reach for the thermos, pour a cup of coffee, and take a slow, satisfying sip. The figure set the cup down and returned to the logbook. The posture relaxed, the shoulders lowered. It was a scene of perfect, professional normalcy. It was exactly what Vance had intended to do this evening. It was his life, continuing without him. A profound sense of grief washed over him, heavier and colder than the rain. He was witnessing his own absence. He had been replaced, and the world, the tower, the job, the paperwork was functioning perfectly well without him. Better, perhaps. The new Vance wasn't wet. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't hesitating. Vance turned away from the window. He could not bear to watch any longer. He felt transparent, as if the wind were blowing through him rather than around him. He began the descent. The metal stairs were slick with ice and algae. Vance moved slowly, gripping the handrails with white-knuckled intensity. Clang, clang, clang. His boots struck the steps with the same heavy rhythm he had heard earlier from the inside. Now, he understood. He was making the sounds of the departure, the inverse of the arrival. The wind tried to peel him off the structure. The tower swayed and groaned, the steel skeleton protesting the violence of the storm. Vance kept his eyes on his feet. He did not look down into the void. He counted the steps. It was the only data he had left. 30, 31, 32. Halfway down, the light from the cabin above began to fade, obscured by the angle of the platform. The darkness swallowed him. He was descending into the deep, drowning canopy of the Blackwood sector. When his boots finally touched the gravel at the base of the tower, his legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in the mud, the impact jarring his spine. He stayed there for a long moment, head bowed, letting the rain hammer against his back. He was shivering uncontrollably now, hypothermia clawing at his extremities. He forced himself to stand. Protocol. Survival. He had to get to the truck. He had to get to the heater. He stumbled toward the trailhead, his boots heavy with mud. He walked 10 yards, then 20. Then he stopped. A compulsion, irrational and magnetic, seized him. He turned around. He looked up. The tower rose into the night, a dark needle piercing the storm clouds. At the very top, suspended in the blackness, the glass cabin shone like a lighthouse. It was a perfect square of brilliance, steady and unblinking. Vance squinted against the rain. Through the glass walls, even from this distance, he could see the silhouette. The figure was standing at the window now. It was looking down. Vance froze. He felt the gaze of the man in the tower pressing on him, a weight that traveled through the air, through the rain, through the dark. The figure raised a hand. It was not a wave. It was not a threat. It was a salute. A slow, formal, crisp salute, delivered with military precision. "Assignment complete," the gesture said. Relieved of duty, Vance stood in the mud, water streaming down his face, and stared at the version of himself that was warm, safe, and correct. He felt a scream building in his throat, a primal rejection of this theft, but it died before it reached his lips. There was no point. The logic was irrefutable. The logbook was signed. The shift was covered. Arthur Vance turned his back on the tower. He walked into the darkness of the trees, his footsteps silent in the roar of the storm, leaving the light to the one who now held the key. The visual confirmation of the figure standing at the base of the tower changed the nature of the silence in the cabin. It was no longer an empty silence, but an expectant one. Arthur Vance stepped back from the glass, his movements stiff and jerky, stripping away the facade of the routine audit. The checklist was forgotten. The inventory was irrelevant. The logic of the storm and the schedule had been replaced by the logic of the siege. He moved immediately to the trapdoor. It was a heavy square of reinforced steel set into the floor grid, designed to withstand gale-force winds and falling debris. He dropped to his knees, the hard impact against the wood barely registering. He slammed the bolt home. It slid into the catch with a heavy, reassuring thunk. For good measure, he engaged the secondary latch, a friction lock that required 2 hands to twist into place. He stood up, breathing hard. The sanctuary was sealed. The glass walls, once a point of pride for their panoramic command, now felt like a liability. He was in a lit aquarium, and the dark ocean outside was pressing in. He retreated to the center of the room, positioning himself behind the heavy oak desk. It was a subconscious maneuver, placing the symbol of his authority between himself and the point of entry. He reached for the flare gun. His hand, usually steady enough to draft architectural schematics, shook as he gripped the orange polymer handle. He broke the barrel open, checked the load, a single red incendiary shell, and snapped it shut. He waited. The storm continued to batter the structure. The wind shrieked through the steel lattice, vibrating the floorboards beneath his boots. Rain lashed the glass in sheets, distorting the world into a slurry of gray and black. But Vance was not listening to the storm. He was listening for the deviation from the storm. Minutes passed. They stretched and warped, measured not by the ticking of his watch, but by the thudding of his pulse in his ears. Then he heard it. It was faint at first, struggling against the roar of the wind. A rhythmic, metallic sound. Clang. Vance's grip on the flare gun tightened until his knuckles turned white. Clang. It was the sound of a boot striking the expanded metal of the staircase steps. It was heavy, deliberate. It did not possess the hurried, frantic cadence of someone seeking shelter from the freezing rain. It had the slow, measured tempo of an inspection. Clang. Vance counted the steps in his head. There were 48 steps from the ground to the catwalk. He was at step 10. He tried to rationalize the sound. A loose panel banging in the wind, thermal contraction of the cooling steel. But the rhythm was too precise. It possessed a sentient interval. Step. Pause. Shift weight. Step. Clang. Step 20. Vance looked at the radio. It remained silent, the amber eye staring blindly into the room. His voice had stopped. The psychological assault had ended. The physical approach had begun. He realized, with a creeping sense of horror, that the figure was not hiding its approach. There was no attempt at stealth. This was not a predator stalking prey. This was an owner returning home. The footsteps conveyed a terrifying sense of entitlement. Clang. Step 30. Vance backed up further, until his heels hit the base of the propane heater. The heat radiated against his legs, a stark contrast to the ice forming in his veins. He raised the flare gun, leveling it at the floor, aiming directly at the trapdoor. "Stop," he called out. His voice sounded thin and reedy in the enclosed space, swallowed instantly by the insulation in the storm. "This is a federal facility. Turn back." Clang. Step 40. The intruder was on the final landing. The footsteps changed tone. They were no longer ringing against the hollow steps. They were flatter, duller, striking the solid steel of the catwalk grating. Scuff, scuff. The sound moved around the perimeter of the cabin. Vance turned in a slow circle, tracking the noise. He could see nothing through the rain-streaked glass, only the reflection of the cabin interior and his own pale, terrified face. The intruder was walking the inspection line, checking the window seals, just as Vance had done an hour ago. The footsteps stopped. They stopped directly in front of the heavy exterior door. Vance held his breath. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. It pressed against his eardrums. He watched the L-shaped handle of the door. It was a solid piece of cast iron, cold and immovable. Slowly, the handle began to depress. It moved downward, fighting the tension of the internal spring. It reached the bottom of its arc and stopped. Then, it rose again. The door did not open. The deadbolt held. Vance let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Physics still applied. A locked door was a locked door. The intruder was outside, in the freezing sleet, without shelter. They would have to leave. They would have to retreat down the stairs. He waited for the sound of frustration, the pounding of fists, the shouting. Instead, he heard a sound that caused his entire reality to fracture. Scrape. It was the small, intimate sound of metal sliding against metal. Vance stared at the keyhole. It was a standard wafer tumbler lock, secure but simple. The sound came again. Click, click, scrape. It was the sound of a key being inserted. Vance's mind reeled. He slapped his hand to his belt pouch. He felt the hard outline of the station key through the canvas. He pulled it out, holding it up to the dim light. It was there. It was in his hand. There were no duplicates. The master key was in the district safe, 50 miles away. The only other key in existence was the one he was holding. And yet, the sound from the door continued. It was smooth, practiced. There was no fumbling, no scratching of a lockpick trying to find the shear line. This was the sound of a matching key engaging the pins. Thunk. The sound of the deadbolt retreating was deafening in the small room. Vance lowered the flare gun slightly, his arm numb. The impossibility of the moment paralyzed him. He was witnessing a violation of the fundamental laws of his world. If the key fits, it is the right key. If he has the key, he is authorized. The handle turned again. This time, there was no resistance. The door cracked open. The wind seized the opportunity, rushing into the breach with a high-pitched shriek. A spray of freezing rain hit the floorboards, darkening the wood. Instantly, papers on the desk fluttered in the sudden draft. The flame of the propane heater danced wildly, casting long, frantic shadows that leaped up the walls. Vance stepped back, raising the flare gun again. He aimed it at the widening gap. "Stay back," he yelled. The command lost in the roar of the wind. The door swung fully open, pushed by a steady, calm hand. Framed in the doorway, silhouetted against the raging dark of the storm, stood a figure. He was tall. He wore the standard-issue gray slicker, dripping with water. He wore the regulation campaign hat, pulled low. He did not rush in. He did not attack. He stepped across the threshold with the casual, weary demeanor of a man ending a long shift. He reached back and closed the door against the wind, pushing it until it latched. He turned the deadbolt, locking it from the inside. The silence returned, sudden and absolute. The figure stood on the doormat, water pooling around his boots. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but to slowly unbutton his slicker. He peeled the wet gear off, revealing a pristine, dry uniform underneath. He looked up. Vance looked into the face of the intruder, and the flare gun slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering loudly onto the floor. The face was his own. It was not a mask. It was not a trick of the light. It was Arthur Vance. But it was an Arthur Vance who looked at the man standing by the heater, not with anger, or malice, or hunger. He looked at him with mild, bureaucratic confusion. "You're late," the intruder said, in Vance's own voice. The audit was due at 16. The statement regarding the time hung in the air, suspended between the roar of the storm outside and the suffocating quiet of the cabin interior. Arthur Vance stood rooted to the floorboards, his mind struggling to process the sensory data it was receiving. The visual input, his own face, his own uniform, his own posture, contradicted the fundamental reality of his existence. Yet, The man standing before him was solid. He displaced air. He cast a shadow against the far wall. He dripped rainwater onto the mat with a rhythmic, terrestrial cadence. Vance's hands, empty now that the flare gun lay uselessly on the floor, trembled at his sides. He waited for the hallucination to fracture, for the stress of the isolation and the altitude to reveal this figure as a trick of the light or a symptom of hypoxia. But the figure did not dissolve. Instead, the intruder turned away, dismissing Vance's presence with a casual, practiced indifference that was far more chilling than any threat. The double moved to the coat rack mounted by the door. He removed his wet slicker, hanging it on the brass peg with a precise, fluid motion. He adjusted the collar so it would dry evenly. He removed his hat, shaking the water from the brim before placing it on the shelf above. Every movement was intimate, the muscle memory of a man who had performed this ritual in this specific room 1,000 times. He was not an invader claiming new territory. He was a resident returning to his quarters. Vance backed away until his legs bumped against the metal housing of the propane heater. The heat radiating from the unit felt distant, as if his body had lost the capacity to register warmth. He watched as the other Arthur Vance smoothed his hair back, straightened his tie, and walked toward the desk. The double moved through the space with an economy of motion that Vance recognized instantly because it was his own. It was the walk of a man who despised wasted energy. He stepped over the fallen flare gun without looking down, treating the bright orange weapon not as a danger, but as a piece of clutter that had been carelessly dropped by a negligent employee. He reached the leather chair. He sat. The chair did not creak. It accepted his weight silently, the springs settling with a soft, contented sigh that Vance had never been able to elicit. The double swiveled slightly, adjusting his position relative to the desk lamp. He reached out and picked up the scattered papers, the decommissioning checklist, the inventory manifest which Vance had knocked over in his panic. With calm, methodical fingers, the double squared the stack of papers. He tapped them against the desktop to align the edges. He placed them back in their designated spot, centered perfectly between the radio and the logbook. Order was being restored, but it was not Vance's order. Vance found his voice. It was a dry, rasping sound, barely audible over the wind. "Who are you?" The figure at the desk did not look up. He picked up the heavy ballpoint pen, clicking it once. The sound was sharp and definitive. "Logistics Officer Vance," the figure said. The voice was calm, modulated, and stripped of all emotion. It was the voice Vance used when recording official depositions. "Sector 4, Shift Night Watch." "I am Vance," Arthur whispered, the assertion sounding weak even to his own ears. "I am the auditor. I have the key." The figure paused. He turned his head slowly, looking at Vance over the rim of his wire-framed spectacles. The expression on his face was not hostile. It was patient. It was the look a teacher gives a student who is struggling to grasp a basic concept. "You have a key," the figure corrected gently. "That does not mean you have the authority." He turned back to the logbook. He opened it to the page where Vance had made his mark, the angry red line striking out the previous entry, the marginalia declaring the data invalid. The double stared at the red ink for a long moment. He let out a soft breath, a sound of mild professional disappointment. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small bottle of correction fluid. He shook it. The clack, clack, clack of the mixing ball inside the bottle echoed in the room like the ticking of a clock. He unscrewed the cap. With delicate, painterly strokes, he began to cover Vance's red line. He painted over the entry invalid note. He painted over the anomalous data stamp. He erased Vance's frantic attempt to assert control, burying it under a layer of pristine, white chemical opacity. Vance watched the erasure of his own actions. He felt a sudden, terrifying sense of transparency. It was as if he were fading, his solidity compromised by the presence of this more efficient, more absolute version of himself. The double was not just occupying the chair. He was occupying Vance's narrative. The correction fluid dried. The page was clean again. The double clicked his pen. He began to write. Entry 002, 17 hours. Weather conditions severe. Structural integrity holding. Perimeter breach detected and resolved. Unauthorized personnel removed from secure area. Vance read the words upside down as they appeared on the page. The handwriting was perfect. It was his handwriting, but better, steadier, firmer, lacking the tremor of fatigue that had plagued him for the last year. "I am not unauthorized," Vance said, his voice rising in a desperate, fracturing plea. "I was sent here. I have the work order. Look at the manifest." The figure stopped writing. He set the pen down. He swiveled the chair fully to face Vance. For the first time, the eyes met. Vance looked into his own pupils and saw nothing. There was no madness. There was no supernatural malice. There was simply a vacuum. It was the eyes of a system, the eyes of a bureaucracy that had calculated the necessary variables and determined that Arthur Vance, the wet, scared, aging man standing by the heater, was a redundancy. "The manifest is complete," the figure said. "The audit is finished. The tower is automated now." "It's not automated," Vance argued, gesturing to the room. "You're here. I'm here. I am the automation," the figure replied. The words were delivered with zero irony. "I am the version of the file that does not make errors. I am the version that does not lose the key. I am the version that does not feel the cold." He gestured toward the window, toward the dark, swirling storm outside. "You are the variable," he said, "and variables must be eliminated to balance the equation." Vance felt the truth of the statement settle into his bones. He looked around the room. The cabin felt brighter now, cleaner. The shadows seemed to retreat from the double, pooling instead around Vance's feet. The radio, which had tormented him with his own voice, sat silent and obedient next to the double's hand. The flare gun lay on the floor, a discarded toy the room had chosen. The tower was a machine of order, and Vance, with his fear, his sweat, his messy red ink, was a source of disorder. The other was the perfect component. The double picked up the pen again. He returned to the logbook, his posture relaxing. He did not tell Vance to leave. He did not threaten him. He simply ceased to acknowledge him. He withdrew his attention so completely that Vance felt the physical sensation of being unmoored, like a boat whose anchor line had been cut. Vance took a step toward the desk. He wanted to grab the book. He wanted to scream. But the air between them felt thick, viscous. The space around the desk was a closed loop, and he was outside of it. He looked at the other's hand moving across the paper. The sound of the pen was hypnotic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of reality being written, moment by moment, by the hand that held the authority. Vance looked down at his own hands. They looked pale, waxy. He felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a hollow ache. He realized that if he stayed here, if he stood in this room and watched this man live his life, he would eventually cease to exist entirely. He would become a shadow on the wall, a draft in the corner, a ghost haunting his own biography. The double turned the page. The sound was final. He reached for the thermos. He poured a cup of coffee. The steam rose in a perfect spiral. He took a sip, his eyes scanning the inventory list, his face a mask of contented concentration. He was at work. He was happy. Vance backed away. He moved slowly, his boots dragging on the floor. He reached the heavy steel door. He did not want to open it. He did not want to go back out into the freezing void, but the pressure in the room was pushing him out. The equilibrium demanded it. He reached behind him and found the handle. The metal was freezing, biting into his palm. The double did not look up. He was checking off items on the list. Item 16. Verify trapdoor security. Vance turned the handle. The latch clicked. The wind roared, waiting for him. "Goodbye, Arthur," the double said, without lifting his eyes from the page. It was not a farewell. It was a clerical notation, a file being closed. Vance pushed the door open and stepped backward into the night. The heavy steel door clicked shut, the latch engaging with a sound that was final and absolute. It was the sound of a vault ceiling or a book closing. On one side of the steel lay light, warmth, and the ordered logic of the audit. On the other side, where Arthur Vance now stood, there was only the wind, the freezing rain, and the chaotic indifference of the dark. Vance did not pound on the door. He did not shout for re-entry. To do so would have been an act of madness, a rejection of the data that had just been presented to him. He understood, with a numb clarity of shock, that he had not been locked out of a room. He had been redacted from a file. He turned away from the door, gripping the icy railing of the catwalk. The wind shoved against him, a physical weight trying to tear him from the structure. The tower swayed beneath his boots, the steel skeleton groaning in the gale, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up through his legs and settled in his chest. He began the descent. The first step was the hardest. It required him to voluntarily move away from the only source of light in the valley. He placed his boot on the top tread of the metal staircase. The expanded steel grate was slick with ice and algae. Clang. The sound was swallowed instantly by the storm. He took another step, then another. He moved with a mechanical slowness, his body operating on autopilot while his mind remained suspended in the room above. With every foot of elevation he lost, the warmth of the cabin became a more distant memory. The cold clamped down on him, stiffening his fingers inside his gloves, turning his breath into ragged plumes of steam that were ripped away by the wind. He did not look back up. He did not need to. He carried the image of the room with him, burned into his retina. He could still see the other Arthur Vance sitting in the leather chair, comfortable and dry, sipping coffee and correcting the logbook. He could imagine the scratch of the pen, the smell of the propane, the satisfying order of the inventory. That version of reality was complete. It was functioning at 100% efficiency. It did not need him. By the time he reached the midpoint of the staircase, the light from the cabin was obscured by the angle of the platform. He was descending into the blind dark of the canopy. The trees below were a thrashing mass of black shapes, moving violently in the wind like a dark ocean. Vance focused on his hands. Left hand on the rail, right hand on the rail. Step down, repeat. It was a new procedure, a new checklist to keep the panic at bay. Step 20. Step 21. He realized, somewhere around step 30, that he was crying. It was a quiet, physiological reaction, the tears mixing with the rain on his face, indistinguishable from the elements. He was not crying for his life. He was crying for his identity. He was mourning the loss of his own competence. The man in the tower was doing a better job. That was the thought that cut the deepest. The entity upstairs was not an imposter. It was an upgrade. Vance reached the bottom of the stairs. His boots sank into the mud, the soft, yielding ground feeling foreign after the rigid steel of the tower. He stumbled, his knees buckling under the sudden change in resistance. He caught himself against a concrete footer, the rough surface scraping his palm. He stood there for a long time, huddled against the base of the tower, seeking shelter from the wind in the lee of the structure. The rain hammered against his hood. The forest around him was a cacophony of noise, cracking branches, rushing water, the endless roar of air moving through pine needles. He was an intruder in the wild now. He was a biological entity with no shell, no badge, no authority. Slowly, the instinct for self-preservation overrode the shock. He needed to move. He needed to get to the truck. He needed to leave this sector before the cold shut his systems down completely. He pushed himself away from the concrete. He turned toward the trailhead, where his vehicle waited if it was still his vehicle, if the key in his pocket still worked, if the world outside the tower still recognized him. Before he walked into the trees, he stopped. He turned around. He looked up. The tower rose into the night, a monolithic spire of gray steel vanishing into the low clouds. At the very top, 60 feet above the mud, the glass cabin glowed. It was a perfect, unwavering square of amber light suspended in the void. It looked like a lighthouse, or an altar. Through the rain-streaked air, Vance could see the silhouette in the window. The other Arthur Vance was standing at the glass, looking down. He was holding the logbook in one hand and the radio microphone in the other. He appeared calm. He appeared to be in the middle of a transmission, filing the report, closing the loop, ensuring that the records were accurate. He did not wave. He did not gloat. He simply watched, his posture relaxed, witnessing the departure of the redundancy. Arthur Vance stood in the mud, shivering, and felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace settle over him. It was the peace of acceptance. The struggle was over. The variable had been eliminated. The equation was balanced. He turned his back on the light. He began to walk toward the tree line. The forest swallowed him instantly. The darkness wrapped around him, thick and absolute. He focused on his feet, placing one boot in front of the other, navigating by the faint gray ribbon of the trail. Behind him, the light of the tower did not fade. It remained steady and bright, a beacon of order in the chaos of the storm. But Vance did not look back again. He walked away from the warmth, away from the logic, away from himself, fading into the noise of the night until he was nothing more than another shadow moving through the trees. The archive was closed. The entry was written. And Arthur Vance, the wet, cold, imperfect man, was no longer required. The journey from the tree line to the trailhead was a passage through a void. The forest was a tunnel of noise and darkness. But Arthur Vance moved through it with the numbness of a man who had already been processed and filed away. He did not feel the cold rain running down his neck. He did not feel the mud sucking at his boots. He was a vessel carrying a consciousness that no longer had a designated coordinate in the world. He reached the truck. It sat alone in the gravel lot, a dark, silent shape. He reached into his pocket, half expecting it to be empty, but his fingers closed around the keys. They were cold and wet. He unlocked the door. The interior light flickered on a weak, yellow dome of illumination that felt sickly compared to the brilliant amber glow of the tower he had left behind. He climbed in. The engine turned over with a reluctant cough. The heater blasted stale, lukewarm air into the cab. Vance did not look in the rearview mirror. He put the truck in gear and drove away, the tires crunching softly on the wet gravel, leaving the Blackwood sector to its new custodian. The drive back to district headquarters took 2 hours. The storm began to break as he descended from the mountains, the heavy sheets of rain tapering off into a fine, misty drizzle. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sky was beginning to lighten, turning the color of wet concrete. Headquarters was a sprawling, brutalist structure of brick and glass, sitting silent in the gray dawn. The parking lot was empty save for the overnight security patrol. Vance parked his truck in his assigned spot, slot 402. He stared at the painted number on the asphalt. It felt presumptuous to occupy it, as if he were squatting in a space reserved for someone else. He entered the building. The automatic doors slid open with a pneumatic hush. The lobby was sterile, smelling of floor wax and industrial sanitizer. The security guard, a man named Miller who had worked the night shift for a decade, looked up from his monitor. "Early start, Mr. Vance," Miller said, nodding. "Or a late finish." Vance stopped. He looked at Miller. He wanted to say, "I am not supposed to be here. I am the error." But the words would not form. Instead, he simply nodded back. "Paperwork," Vance whispered. The word felt heavy on his tongue. "Always the paperwork," Miller agreed, turning back to his screen. Vance took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway was lined with fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, insectile buzz. He walked past the rows of empty cubicles, past the silent break room, to his office at the end of the corridor. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly as he had left it 2 days ago. His spare coat hung on the rack. His framed degrees hung on the wall, perfectly leveled. His inbox was empty. He sat down at his desk. The computer terminal stared at him, a black mirror reflecting his haggard, rain-streaked face. He woke the machine. The screen flared to life, bathing him in a harsh, blue-white glow. He needed to see it. He needed the confirmation. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. While he had been stumbling down the mountain in the freezing rain, while he had been shivering in the mud at the base of the tower, the report had been filed. He double-clicked the file. It opened instantly. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. Vance read the executive summary. The language was concise, devoid of fluff, and absolutely accurate. It detailed the structural integrity of the bolts. It noted the exact count of the flare shells. It listed the barometric pressure readings at hourly intervals. He scrolled down to the section on personnel. Officer status: optimal. Incidents: none. Notes: environmental conditions severe. Operational efficiency maintained at 100%. Transition to automation successful. It was the report he had intended to write. It was the report he would have written had he not been flawed, had he not been afraid, had he not hesitated at the door. He reached the bottom of the document. There was the digital signature: Arthur Vance, Senior Logistics Officer. It was authenticated by his unique encryption key, a key that existed only on his secure ID badge, which was currently clipped to his wet shirt. The logic was circular and impenetrable. The system recognized the report as valid. Therefore, the report was valid. Therefore, the Arthur Vance who filed it was the valid Arthur Vance. Vance sat back in his chair. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder, drilling into his skull. He looked at his muddy hands. He looked at the clean, perfect document on the screen. He understood now. The tower wasn't haunted. The woods weren't haunted. The system itself was the ghost. It demanded perfection, and when the human component failed to provide it, the system generated a component that would. He reached for the mouse. He hovered the cursor over the delete button. He could erase it. He could purge the file. He could call the director, explain the hallucination, explain the doppelganger, explain the madness. He could scream until they dragged him away, but that would be disorderly. That would be messy. That would leave a gap in the records. Vance moved the cursor away from delete. He moved it to close. Click. The file vanished from the screen, safely stored in the permanent archive. The audit was complete. Vance stood up. He took off his wet jacket and hung it on the rack. He took off his muddy boots and placed them neatly in the corner. He walked out of his office, leaving the door unlocked. He did not go home. He walked down the hall to the elevator. He pressed the button for the basement level, the archives. The doors opened onto a vast, windowless room filled with rows of metal shelving that stretched into the dim distance. The air here was cool, dry, and smelled of old paper and dust. It was a place of absolute silence, a tomb for data. Vance walked to the intake desk. The archivist, an elderly woman who rarely spoke, looked up. "Transfer request," Vance said softly. She pushed a form across the counter without asking questions. Vance picked up a pen. He filled out the transfer request, reassigning himself from field logistics to archive management. Reason for transfer: incompatibility with field operations. He signed the paper. He handed it back. "Approved," she said, stamping it with a heavy, rhythmic thud. Vance walked into the stacks. He found a desk in the back, surrounded by boxes of uncatalogued files from the 1970s. He sat down. He turned on the small, green-shaded desk lamp. The circle of light was small, contained, and safe. He picked up a file at random. He opened it. He began to read. This was his place now. He was the memory of the system. He was the dust that settled on the records. The other Arthur Vance, the perfect, efficient, automated Arthur Vance, was out there in the world, driving the truck, climbing the towers, signing the forms. He was keeping the lights on. But down here, in the dark, the real Arthur Vance, or perhaps the echo that remained of him, had a different job. He would watch the mistakes. He would catalog the errors. He would look for the red lines that had been painted over with white fluid. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the faded type of an old incident report. He found a discrepancy in the dates, a small error, a crack in the logic. He picked up his pen. He made a small, careful note in the margin. Outside, the sun was rising over the headquarters, illuminating the glass and the brick. Inside the tower on the ridge, the automated sensors were humming, sending perfect streams of data to the servers. But here, in the silence of the basement, the archive was open. Vance worked. He did not look at the clock. He did not think about the rain. He simply read and wrote and filed, letting the noise of the day fade away into the quiet rustle of turning pages. The file is closed. Until we unseal the next entry, sleep well. The archive is now closed. Until we unseal the next file, sleep well.